Hello and welcome to a brand new series here on the TLDR Global channel. I don't know about you, but I find that there's often so much going on in the news each week that it's hard to pay attention to everything happening in your own country. So when it comes to global issues, it's not uncommon for big things to pass us by. So in this series, we're aiming to bring you a rundown of what you might have missed, outlining a few major stories from around the world. For each story, we've also added links to the description of this video to give you further reading. So if you want to dive deeper into any of them, they'll be there for you. Okay, so are you ready to get going? Well, first make sure you're subscribed to the channel, as a lot of you aren't, and subscribing is the only way to make sure that you never miss a TLDR Global video, or one of these weekly summaries going forward. Let's start with probably the biggest story right now. In Myanmar, a number of major political leaders have been detained by the military, including Aung San Suu Kyi, the country's state chancellor, a position equivalent to prime minister. This coup comes on the back of Suu Kyi's landslide election win, which army officials have described as being marred with fraud. This coup is not only the latest escalation of tensions between the military and the government, but with Parliament scheduled to meet this week for the first time since the election, it also prevents the result from being enshrined into law, and the new government from being installed. We'll make sure to keep you updated on this as it evolves. Europe has suffered from some pretty widespread unrest in the last week, with protests erupting in both Russia and the Netherlands. The protests in Russia relate to the arrest of the country's most significant opposition leader, Alexei Navalny. The Navalny case is complex and one we don't have time to discuss again today, but some 400,000 protesters took to the streets last week to protest the treatment of Navalny and the wider state of Russia's political system. The Kremlin seems pretty unfazed though, remarking that more people voted for Putin than are now protesting. Although that's maybe more of an indictment of Russia's 2018 election, where Navalny was barred from even running. In the Netherlands, protests have erupted in relation to the country's latest COVID restrictions, with much of the anger sparking from new curfews enforced on citizens. Since the major protests and riots of last week, things do seem to have calmed down slightly, though the police were quick to break up an anti-lockdown protest this weekend, fearing that it could spark into yet more unrest. That's not all when it comes to European uncertainty though, with Italy's Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte tendering his resignation last week, largely as a result of disputes within the governing alliance about their COVID economic recovery package. Over the weekend, talks continued in an attempt to form a new government, but thus far at least, efforts have been unsuccessful. The Italian PM's not the only one on the way out though, with the Prime Minister of Mongolia also leaving office. Last week, Mongolians took to the streets of the nation's capital to protest the government's handling of the pandemic, and more specifically the mistreatment of a particular patient in hospital. This was the story of a woman who gave birth to her child before testing positive for COVID, and being immediately transferred to a hospital for infectious diseases, transferred in a dressing gown in the freezing cold. This, on top of the government's wider mishandling of the pandemic, led to protests in the country, very successful protests at that, because after only one day of protesting, the Prime Minister announced the resignation of his entire government. However, some have speculated that this could all be a cynical ploy to try and improve the party's reputation ahead of June's presidential elections. Speaking of protests, it's not just Russia, the Netherlands and Mongolia. India also saw major protests continue into last week. India's farmers' protests have been going on for months now, with hundreds of thousands of protesters representing more than 40 different unions holding down camps in a 1,500-kilometre area. They were originally kept out of the country's capital by Modi's government. However, this changed last week when protesters made it to Red Fort, an iconic location in the capital. This move was made yet more powerful by the fact it happened on India's Republic Day. This clearly shows a continuation and escalation of tensions that I'll be sure to update you on in the future. COVID may have sparked protests and led to resignations around the world, but it's had an even more direct impact on some world leaders. In Zimbabwe, 3 senior officials died, including the foreign minister, who became the face of 2017's coup against Mugabe. In Colombia, their defense minister, a man touted to be in line for the presidency, also died of the virus. Mexico's president has also contracted the virus, although reports suggest that the leader's health is improving. Over in Mali, the country's troops, alongside French forces, have continued their fight against jihadists. The country has been fighting against jihadist uprisings since 2012, when an insurgency started in the north of the country. France first intervened in 2013, but fighting has continued since then, with some 5,100 French troops in the region. Last week, they reported that 100 terrorists were neutralised, about 20 captured, and several motorbikes and war equipment seized. This was seen by many as a positive indicator out of the region. Just to the southeast, Nigeria has also been dealing with the jihadi insurgency, with jihadists recently capturing a military base in the northeast of Nigeria. The growing issue with jihadists actually led the country's president to replace a number of key military leaders in an attempt to satiate those criticising the government's response to the insurgency. Let's quickly turn to India, where there have been two more major developments. Firstly, conflict has supposedly restarted between China and India in a continuation of the border conflicts between the countries. We discussed this issue in a video last year, but this time, fighting was focused on the border in the Sikkim region. Reports suggest that Chinese patrol officials attempted to enter Indian territory before being pushed back. The Indian government has insisted that this was just a minor face-off, but a source for the Times of India has reported that there was a full brawl, which led to both sides calling in reinforcements. Secondly, yesterday India also announced a new pandemic budget. There were three key elements to the plan, with the budget focusing on divestment, with the government set to divest $23 billion worth of assets, including public sector companies like Air India, a big boost for infrastructure spending, apparently to help better connect the country and kickstart the economy, and a huge 137% increase in health spending, more than doubling spending on health, with billions ring-fenced for their vaccination program. Let's close this video by discussing the pandemic again, looking to Algeria. While nations around the world have been scrambling to get their hands on vaccines, even leading to a completely separate dispute between the UK and EU over vaccines, Algeria is not hunting down the big names. Instead, the country's in talks with Russia to begin production of Russia's Sputnik 5 vaccine in the country. Supposedly, both sides have reached an agreement, but no timeline's yet been announced for when Algerian production of the vaccine will begin. Domestic production aside, Algeria is already using Russian vaccines, with over 500,000 arriving on Friday, and more Chinese vaccines set to arrive in the coming days. By contrast, the AstraZeneca vaccines ordered by the country aren't set to arrive until next month, highlighting disparities in how vaccines are distributed, and how vaccine nationalism is pushing some countries towards more unusual vaccines. So those are some of the biggest stories in the news this week. Think we missed something? Then let us know in the comments below. If you want daily summaries like these, then make sure to subscribe to the TLDR Daily Briefing on the TLDR Daily channel. It's linked down below. And to get your weekly summary next week, make sure you're subscribed right here. Thanks for your support, and a special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. If you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.